Love him or hate him, there has never been a professional wrestler quite like Brock Lesnar. Off and on for the past 2 decades, on his best days, the beastly, jarringly athletic Lesnar reminds us of why he's an absolute freak in the most positive sense of the word. When Lesnar first erupted upon the WWE scene in the post-Attitude Era world, people quickly predicted that Brock would be a main event mainstay year after year after year. And they nailed it, as far as his second run with WWE goes. That's because the first one ended very prematurely, as Lesnar went from making an explosive debut to headlining pay-per-views to racking up accomplishments to one day leaving WWE in his rear view, going from can't miss to won't miss it. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the true story of when Brock Lesnar left WWE. Though he's not known to be signed with WWE at press time, Brock Lesnar will more than likely reappear in Vince McMahon's rings once more, just as soon as Vinnie Mac deems it necessary to back the Brinks truck up to Lesnar's hunting grounds. For Lesnar, his WWE arrangement is worth envying. Get paid millions a year to wrestle only a handful of marquee matches, some of which are shorter than your standard drag race, while other times simply standing in the ring while your agent does all the talking for you. All of this while forgoing the irksome touring schedule, and you can get back to doing what you do best: go bear hunting armed with only a 2x4. When you consider Lesnar's sheer physical presence, his celebrity in another sport, and the mind-boggling feats of athleticism that he does between the ropes, it's obvious why WWE would want to give him such a deferential, perk-laden deal, akin to a king's ransom in a way. They just really want to make sure that he stays on their team. But it wasn't always this way. Lesnar's first WWE contract was worth $250,000 a year, which sounds like peanuts compared to the windfall that would await him. But this contract requires a bit of perspective. At the time Lesnar signed it, he was an untrained pro wrestling prospect being paid $250,000 a year just to train in their developmental program. Fresh off winning the NCAA Division I Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in 2000, Lesnar signed to WWE and reported to Ohio Valley Wrestling. There, he was paid handsomely to train within their system, and certainly they were expecting a huge return on their investment. Less than 2 years later, Lesnar arrived on the main roster, debuting on Monday Night Raw the night after WrestleMania 18. As Paul Heyman looked on, Brock demolished a collection of hardcore championship combatants, drawing oohs and ahs from the sheer ferocity that he was displaying. On night one of his main roster run, it was clear that Brock Lesnar was going places. Life for Lesnar continued along these same lines, brutalizing various mid-card wrestlers through unannounced, unprovoked attacks, all of them just mere windows into what Lesnar could do in a standard match. His first true rivals were the Hardy Boys, and this was ideal. If Lesnar was a cataclysmic force of nature, then the aerodynamic, bumptastic Hardy Boys were the ideal human driftwood that could get swept up in Brock's unnatural fury. After dismantling Matt and Jeff on the regular, Lesnar continued cutting a path of destruction into the King of the Ring tournament, where he pummeled Rob Van Dam en route to the crown. With the royal honours came the fast track to the richest prize in the sport, the WWE Championship. Lesnar was booked to dethrone The Rock for the WWE title at the 2002 SummerSlam, which would occur only 6 weeks after Lesnar's 25th birthday. To crystallize the idea of Lesnar as an unflinching badass, both he and The Rock appeared in training vignettes to hype up the SummerSlam match. In Lesnar's videos, he was shown performing inhuman feats, like jogging down the roadside with an uprooted tree over one shoulder, or submitting himself to a 15-minute post-workout bath completely submerged in ice-filled water. The Rock is still obviously The Rock, but against a human polar bear, the torch-passing title change was all but academic before it even began. Lesnar's first reign was defined by his hate-filled feud with a fellow monster in The Undertaker. There were unnecessary bits of soap opera injected into the story, but all of that went by the wayside once they reached No Mercy. It was there that Lesnar retained the WWE title in one of the greatest and goriest Hell in a Cell matches of all time. Brock lost the title the following month to The Big Show at Survivor Series after Heyman turned against his client, but from there, Lesnar became a babyface. He chased Big Show and later Kurt Angle for the championship that had been stolen from him. After winning the 2003 Royal Rumble, Lesnar went on to WrestleMania 19 in Seattle to challenge Angle for the gold. Despite, as we all know, badly blowing a shooting star press to the point where he nearly broke his own neck, Lesnar rebounded to finish Angle with an F5, capturing the belt for a second time. 2 world title reigns, a King of the Ring crown, and a Royal Rumble win, all in the first year of his main roster run. And a new contract was going to reflect his lofty standing. In July of 2003, Lesnar put pen to paper on a new 7-year deal with a downside of $1 million a year. If seen through to the end, Lesnar would have been a full-time WWE star into the summer of 2010, shortly before his 33rd birthday. Of course, we know that Lesnar would not make it through the length of this deal. In fact, he barely made it 8 months. Even as Lesnar signed the contract in 2003, he was already tired with life on the road. As WWE Champion, a position that he likely would have had for the majority of that 7-year run because, he's Brock Lesnar, he was probably going to be depended on as a headline attraction. His name and face would sell pay-per-views, attract a TV audience, draw for house shows, and be used for crossover appeal through various media appearances. As such, unless he was seriously injured to the point where travel wouldn't be advisable, Lesnar was going to have to make these towns, whether it was New York City or some sea town in the Midwest. And because WWE was a global entity, there were also tours of Europe, Asia, Australia, and elsewhere in which the emerging face of WWE would lead the charge. Despite signing such a long-term deal, however, Lesnar had quickly come to realize that he wasn't about that life. Going back to his first reign as champion, Lesnar went to extreme lengths to mask serious physical pain. He claims he was dealing with broken ribs as well as a torn PCL in his right knee. Lesnar would admit to overindulging on Vicodin while washing it down with copious amounts of alcohol. Part of the toll he paid for this self-medication was an inability to take in the natural highs of his megastar life. In his memoir Death Clutch, Lesnar wrote, "You want to know why there aren't more stories in this book about my pro wrestling days? Because the truth is, I don't remember a lot about that period of my life." Lesnar does, however, estimate running through a bottle of vodka every day or two, as well as a couple hundred pain pills every month. By his account, Lesnar was losing sight of reality while pushing through the WWE grind. The headliner money was appealing to him, but he lamented not being able to enjoy his life to any real degree. He'd ask for time off here and there, but was unable to get anything substantial granted due to his status as the SmackDown brand's top star. In addition to dangerously self-medicating, Lesnar was looking for other ways to make the superstar lifestyle easier on himself. To make travel less stressful, he went to the trouble of buying his own plane and having a friend fly him around to avoid the hassle of public airports. The hassle being both the long lines and being hounded for pictures and autographs by fans who could quickly recognize Brock amid a sea of mere mortals. But pains and travel issues weren't all that were eating away at Lesnar. He also grew tired of what he perceived were head games from the company's top officials. In his memoir With Years of Hindsight, Lesnar noted the traps that pro wrestlers fall into when they live day by day within the WWE system. Lesnar felt the manipulation from Vince McMahon and other officials was so strong that wrestlers would be willing to subject themselves to a hellish lifestyle just to get ahead in the organization. As Lesnar wrote, Vince can suggest anything he wants, and as long as he says it'll be great for your character, there's a bunch of guys ready and willing to do whatever he says. They are brainwashed and they don't even know it. Brock admits that he himself wasn't immune to these hard sells. He felt he allowed John Laurinaitis and Jim Ross to talk him into the shooting star press spot at WrestleMania 19, which he says he hadn't previously been keen on. By the time Lesnar was broached by McMahon about dropping the title to Eddie Guerrero in early 2004, he'd lost his faith in the bosses. As Brock describes it, the pitch to lose to Eddie was done in such a way that Vince downplayed that result and instead strongly emphasized the ensuing WrestleMania showdown with Goldberg, in which Lesnar would squash the outgoing former WCW star. Vince's pitch reportedly emphasized that Lesnar versus Goldberg at WrestleMania was so big that it wouldn't need to even be for the title. Phrased as it was, Lesnar felt that Vince softening the blow of the title loss was his shrewd attempt at hard-selling Lesnar on a more positive result, the win over Goldberg, instead of just leveling with him and saying, "Hey, we want you to lose to Eddie, nothing personal, we just want to capitalize on his popularity." Already weary from the travel, as well as the constant aches and pains and the lack of a home life, Lesnar did not appreciate the apparent carny approach from his boss, the latest in a long line of grievances he had had against WWE and the handling of his life and career. The next grievance would have to do with the company's tour of South Africa. No longer WWE champion, Lesnar was booked to work triple threat matches with Guerrero and Angle for the WWE title on the South African tour. However, the match was changed to just Guerrero versus Angle, the reasoning being that the two needed to work on their upcoming match for WrestleMania 20. Lesnar was instead given Hardcore Holly to work with, the same Hardcore Holly that Lesnar put away in 6 minutes at the previous month's Royal Rumble. While Lesnar says that he likes Holly, he felt it was beneath him to take 2 ungodly long flights to South Africa and back on a commercial airliner, not his personal one, just to virtually squash Holly in relatively short matches. He tried to ask for a little bit of time off instead of making the tour, but was reportedly told by Laurinaitis that he was needed on the cards. Just a quick show of hands amongst any fans who may have attended those shows in South Africa, would your patronage have been any different if Brock Lesnar had no-showed? Feel free to comment below. The wearying travel schedule continued as Lesnar flew all the way back to the States. He flew into New York, boarded a flight to Atlanta, then caught another connecting flight to Savannah, Georgia, just so he could wrestle Holly again at the SmackDown tapings. Brock had had enough. The travel, the orders from his bosses, the constant pain, the inability to lead a normal life under these circumstances. The money was no longer worth it, and so Brock Lesnar decided he was quitting. That day in Savannah, Lesnar had a tense meeting with Vince McMahon where he told him in no uncertain terms that he was quitting. Vince was unable to change Lesnar's opinion, and the pair eventually agreed that Brock would stay on through WrestleMania before exiting stage left. Before the following week's SmackDown taping, Lesnar addressed the locker room in a pre-show meeting, informing everyone that he was leaving after Mania. And after that, word got out. This of course led to one of the most awkward matches in WrestleMania history, as the crowd inside MSG knew full well that both Goldberg and Lesnar were headed out the door as soon as the match was over. The fans not only booed both men for ostensibly deserting the company, but they soundly rejected the energy both men were putting on display. Whereas their WrestleMania 33 speedrun is considered one of the best sub-5-minute matches in wrestling history, this 14-minute slog was like Orange Cassidy wrestling an unidentified corpse plucked from the morgue earlier that day. What I'm saying here is, there wasn't much life in the contest. The most cheers, in fact, went to Steve Austin, the special guest referee, who beat up both guys after the match was done. Goldberg actually won this dreadful bout, probably because Vince was angrier at the homegrown Lesnar for his apparent treachery. With the match now in his past, 26-year-old Brock had plenty of options at his disposal. But there was one problem: the release that he signed in order to leave WWE. In his haste to get out of the company that had made him moody and miserable, Lesnar signed his release form before his lawyer even had a chance to read it over and get back to him. What an impatient Brock had done here was royally screw himself over. The release stipulated that Brock was not allowed to participate in any other sport or sports entertainment product until mid-2010, over 6 years away. Somehow, football was exempt, as Lesnar tried out for the Minnesota Vikings of the NFL that summer. Playing defensive line, Lesnar survived deep into the preseason, but was one of the team's final mandated cuts before the regular season began. He then decided to discontinue chasing this football dream. The following year, however, Lesnar debuted for New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he immediately won the IWGP Heavyweight title, and this was a clear violation of his release stipulations, and it led to a long court battle between WWE and Lesnar. Somewhat incredibly, WWE agreed to settle with Lesnar due to concerns that a judgment may be made against the legality of their non-compete clauses, and then who knows how many wrestlers would be willing to challenge them going forwards because there'd have been a legal precedent. Lesnar was not only now free and clear to continue wrestling, but also take up a sport that he ended up doing pretty well in, shall we say. Not only did Brock win the UFC heavyweight title in 2008, but he became one of the organization's top box office attractions. The 1.6 million buys for his 2009 fight with Frank Mir were a promotional record that stood for 7 years. As of mid-2021, Lesnar co-headlined 4 of the top 18 UFC events in terms of pay-per-view buys, and he joins Conor McGregor as the only other fighter to headline at least 4 UFC pay-per-views that surpassed 1 million buys. After Lesnar's MMA retirement at the end of 2011, he made the transition back into pro wrestling, where his box office track record helped him achieve the ultimate life-work balance. Lesnar's ability to positively affect the bottom line, which is to draw a very interested crowd, led to WWE offering him deals that suited his preferences: maximum money for minimum appearances. But those kind of contracts don't happen if Lesnar doesn't make that initial move to leave WWE when he does, and if he and WWE don't end up butting heads in court. Brock had to escape WWE to prove his value elsewhere, and prove it he most certainly did. With a chance to reacquire Lesnar in 2012, WWE deferred to Brock's box office appeal and name value, as well as his preference to live as simple a life as possible, hence the part-timer deals that many fans tend to groan at today. So much of Brock Lesnar's life post-2004 has been a whirlwind. A veritable F5 of fame and success, much of which has been tied into professional wrestling. It's crazy to think about when you remember that at age 26, it looked for all the world like the Beast incarnate had already wrestled his final ever match.